it's time to learn about hooks. So we've been talking quite a bit about lots of patterns in React. All of them have to do with sharing functionality, creating cleaner abstractions, and creating an API for somebody who might be using this component in various situations. So there's quite a bit of options, as you can tell. A lot of them are not deprecated, but they become a bit dated when you start looking at this next API. The hooks API cleans up quite a bit of what may have been very cumbersome in previous implementations. Now, there's some things to keep in mind here. One of those is that this is fully backwards compatible. It's totally opt-in. It's not something that the React team plans on having be like the standard way or the only way to do something. They're all for giving us as many options as we can handle for doing whatever we need to do with this library. So that's a great thing. We're going to keep class components. It's not something that we're going to lose. So understanding that that interface and that API is still something that's going to be useful in a lot of situations. But having an option where, say, I need state, but there's no other reason to have a class component other than I just need a little bit of state for, say, an input. So we've got a tiny form with one input. I don't need to refactor my function component into an entire class component just because I need that. So it cleans that up a bit. It makes it a little bit less cumbersome to make that transition. What it also does is blur the line between what should be a class component and what should be a function component. So that's a big gripe that I have with it. And that's one reason that I've been really hesitant to move over to hooks. That said, all of Tag v5 is function components. There's not a single class component in there, and I don't see a reason to put one there. So I've come full circle on this. I'm on board with hooks. But I do recognize that it's created a bit of confusion in that area. So that said, there are some rules to hooks. One of those rules is that they can only be called from another hook or from a function component. So that's very important to keep in mind. You can't use these in class components. You can only use them in function components. And you can't put them in a regular function somewhere. They don't work that way. They need to be called from either a hook that is used in a function component or in a function component at the root. So that's the other rule, is you don't call these inside of loops. You don't call these inside of other functions. You can't call them conditionally. They need to be called at the root of the component. And that's for good reason. Otherwise, it would be mayhem. People would be using these all over the places and creating all kinds of problems. So they wanted to avoid that. I respect that decision, and I think it's a good one. I think these very simple rules keep you out of a lot of trouble. So with that said, let's look a little bit at... Sorry, my dog's upset. Let's look a little bit at syntax. So let's start on line 9 here. We have use state. So use state, in this case, is taking in an array. So when I instantiate state here, what it gets is an empty array. So the way that we can imagine this is if we're looking at a class component, this is exactly the same as that. That's all this is. So this is your state instantiation. Now, what's cool about hooks is you don't just have one state. You can create multiple state, I would say objects, but that's a bit of a misnomer because they can be strings, they can be booleans, they can be arrays, they can be objects. They can be really whatever you want. So in this particular case, state is an array. It's an array of our to-dos, and we're instantiating it with an empty object. Now, this destructuring here could be a bit confusing, but essentially what this means is use state is returning an array to us, but we're picking off the first and second item in that array, the first item being our items. That phrasing's a bit confusing, but the first item in that array is what our state is. So that could be our state object, that could be our state array in this case, that could be our string that we're updating or using in some way. So it could be really anything, but in this case, it's our array of items. The second item in the array that useState returns is an updater function. And so what that allows us to do is in this function, we pass it in a new state object. So there's a general rule in React that we don't manipulate. We have a bit of functional kind of style in here, which is where you don't want to manipulate data or mutate data. You want to replace data with something new. So that means copying over sometimes what data was in that array and then adding to it, as we do here on line 16. And other times it's filtering out from what is in data, right? So this array filter function in JavaScript returns a new array. And what we're doing here on line 16 is creating a new array and spreading the existing items from the array in there. So in both of these cases, we're following that standard of returning a new state object. So we're not trying to directly mutate what's in there. So that's useState. You can see on line 10 here, our state is a Boolean. So, you know, that's an example of where we're not going to, you know, keep track of an entire array or a whole object that's state. This is just a Boolean. So you could do the same thing with a string, where, you know, we could call this a string of true and a string of false, and then we'd have to do this dumb thing down here where it's, you know, this equals what? True, right? But we can just use a Boolean. You get the point. So useState, very useful. UseEffect is a bit more, I don't want to say advanced, but it can be very confusing. UseState is for asynchronous effects, or I'm sorry, UseEffect is for asynchronous effects. And in this case, we are fetching data, which is an asynchronous action. So what this allows us to do is essentially what you would do in component did mount or component did update. It can emulate other React lifecycle hooks where you would do this asynchronous work, but it gives you a hook version of those. And so in this particular configuration with an empty array as the second argument, it only runs on mount. So this effectively is component did mount. There are other configurations where it emulates other lifecycle hooks where maybe you're looking for a particular prop to change. So if we're looking at props as they come into this function component, this would allow us to run UseEffect when props change or update. So there are lots of ways to use UseEffect. It's very, very versatile, and there are lots of other kind of baseline hooks or hooks that are coming directly from React. So I would encourage you to dig into their documentation. It's incredibly good. Their explanation of their reasoning behind hooks is quite good, but their explanation of how to use these hooks in various situations is incredibly good and straightforward. So definitely take a look at their documentation for hooks, and we will get into writing a custom hook, probably this as its own standalone hook, and how that looks, how that works in our next video.